Before the palaces burned, the messages began to change. They became shorter, more urgent. A king asked for grain, another asked for troops. Along the coast, ships were reported where ships should not have been. In the great cities of the eastern Mediterranean, people still kept records, collected taxes, loaded cargo, and prayed in temples built to outlast generations. They did not yet know that their world was already dying. In Ugarit, a wealthy port on the Syrian coast, King Hammurabi sent a desperate appeal. Enemy ships had come. His towns had been set on fire. But there would be no rescue, not because the message was ignored, but because the powers he depended on were collapsing too. Soon, Ugarit would be destroyed and never rebuilt. Then came the silence. Across the Mediterranean, royal courts vanished. The Hittite capital was abandoned. Mycenaean palaces burned. Trade routes that carried bronze, grain, timber, glass, and weapons stopped functioning. In some places, writing itself disappeared. For centuries afterward, the survivors would live among ruins whose builders they could no longer name. Something had broken the ancient world. Not one army, not one disaster, but a sequence of failures so tightly connected that when one kingdom fell, it pulled others down with it. This is the story of the Bronze Age collapse, when empires discovered that the end does not always arrive with one final blow. Sometimes it arrives quietly, first as a missing ship, then as an empty granary, then as smoke on the horizon. Around 1300 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean was ruled by great powers. Egypt commanded the Nile Valley and much of the southern Levant. The Hittite Empire dominated Anatolia and northern Syria. Assyria was rising in Mesopotamia. Babylon remained wealthy and prestigious. Across the Aegean, Mycenaean palace kingdoms controlled fortified centers such as Mycenae, Pylos, and Thebes. Between them stood smaller but vital states: Cyprus, Ugarit, Byblos, Alatia, and dozens of coastal cities whose wealth depended on ships, merchants, scribes, and royal diplomacy. This was not a primitive, isolated world. It was an international system. Egyptian gold traveled north. Cedar wood came from Lebanon. Copper came from Cyprus. Tin arrived through distant and complicated routes. Together, copper and tin made bronze, the metal that armed soldiers, equipped craftsmen, strengthened tools, and helped keep royal economies functioning. A king in Greece could depend on resources from hundreds or even thousands of miles away. A palace in Anatolia could require grain from Syria. A merchant ship might carry copper ingots, ivory, glass, pottery, spices, weapons, and luxury goods through waters shared by rival powers. The world had networks, it had bureaucracy, it had supply chains, and that was its strength. It was also its weakness. The palace was the heart of the late Bronze Age state. It collected taxes, stored grain, organized labor, ordered weapons, kept records, and redistributed resources. Farmers, herders, craftspeople, sailors, soldiers, and administrators were tied into a hierarchy controlled from above. As long as harvests came in, roads remained open, and ships reached their ports, the system worked. But a palace economy could not easily absorb disruption. If grain failed to arrive, people went hungry. If trade slowed, bronze production suffered. If armies were sent far from home, vulnerable cities lost defenders. If local rulers lost faith in a distant king, rebellion became possible. The system did not need every part to fail at once. It only needed enough links to break. At first, the warning signs were scattered. In the late 13th century BCE, the Hittites were fighting difficult wars. Egypt was defending its frontiers. Mycenaean centers were expanding fortifications, perhaps expecting danger. In Syria and Anatolia, royal letters recorded urgent requests for food and military support. These were not abstract worries. They were signs of human desperation. In Ugarit, officials wrote about hunger. Grain was no longer merely wealth or tribute. It had become survival. Elsewhere, shortages may have strained communities already living close to the limits of what their political systems could manage. A poor harvest could be endured. 2 poor harvests could be disastrous. Several years of food stress could transform anxiety into migration, unrest, raiding, disease, and war. Evidence from climate research suggests that parts of the eastern Mediterranean experienced unusually dry conditions during this period. Dryness alone did not automatically destroy an empire, but it could reduce harvests precisely when governments needed food to feed cities, armies, laborers, and displaced people. The question was no longer whether the palace could provide abundance, it was whether it could provide anything at all. And when a government could not feed its people, its authority began to look like a lie. The Hittite Empire offers one of the clearest examples of how quickly this pressure could become fatal. For centuries, the Hittites had been one of the great powers of the Near East. Their capital, Hattusa, stood in central Anatolia, behind immense walls, gates, temples, storehouses, and archives. Hittite kings commanded chariots, negotiated treaties with Egypt, and ruled an empire that stretched into Syria. They had survived rivals, rebellions, and wars before, but their position was deteriorating. Their empire depended on vassal states, tribute, agricultural production, and long supply lines. When hunger and instability spread, those dependencies became liabilities. Cities needed protection. Armies needed supplies. Provinces needed loyalty. Yet the center could not answer every crisis at once. The Hittites faced conflict on several fronts, while the world around them was becoming harder to control. Then, sometime around the early 12th century BCE, Hattusa was abandoned. The great capital was not replaced by another Hittite imperial center. The empire itself disappeared. For those who had lived under Hittite rule, this was not an archaeological term called collapse. It was the disappearance of officials, wages, stored grain, protection, law, and the predictable order of life. A powerful empire had become a memory. To the west, the Mycenaean world was also coming apart. The Mycenaeans are often remembered through later Greek legends, kings, warriors, great halls, and the world associated with the Trojan War. Yet the real Mycenaean palace states were administrative machines. Their scribes recorded workers, livestock, land, textiles, religious offerings, and military preparations on clay tablets written in Linear B. Those tablets reveal a society organized from palace centers outward. But around 1200 BCE, several major Mycenaean sites suffered destruction or abandonment. Pylos, one of the best documented palace centers, burned. Its clay tablets were accidentally preserved only because the fire baked them hard enough to survive for thousands of years. The very flames that marked the end of the palace preserved its final paperwork. Some records from Pylos appear to show preparations for danger along the coast. Watchers were stationed, resources were being organized. Whether the threat came from raiders, rival Greeks, internal conflict, or some combination remains uncertain. What is clear is that the palace system did not recover. Without palaces, the scribes disappeared. Without scribes, Linear B vanished from Greece. Population declined in some areas. Long-distance trade shrank. Monumental construction faded. The rich, centralized world of Mycenaean Greece gave way to a far smaller and more fragmented society. Later generations would inherit stories of heroic kings, but the kingdoms themselves had fallen silent. Along the Syrian coast, the crisis arrived with terrifying speed. Ugarit had been a wealthy, cosmopolitan port. Its rulers exchanged letters with Egypt, the Hittites, Cyprus, and other states. Its scribes wrote in several languages and scripts. Its warehouses handled goods from across the Mediterranean. From the outside, it looked like exactly the kind of city that should survive. Connected, prosperous, sophisticated. But connection became danger when every neighbor was in trouble. A letter from Ugarit's final king, Amurapi, gives the catastrophe a human voice. He reported that enemy ships had come, that his cities had been burned, and that his own troops and chariots were away in Hittite territory while his ships were elsewhere. His kingdom had been left exposed at the worst possible moment. Imagine the cruelty of that situation. The king knew the danger was coming. He knew he needed soldiers. He knew he needed ships. But the resources that might have saved his city had been committed to the wider imperial system. The network that had once made Ugarit rich had made it unable to stand alone. Ugarit was destroyed around the beginning of the 12th century BCE. Its archives were left behind in the ruins, preserving letters that read like messages from a world dying in real time. The enemy ships in those letters are often connected to the so-called Sea Peoples. That name has become one of the most famous and most misunderstood parts of the Bronze Age collapse. Egyptian inscriptions, especially those associated with the reign of Ramesses III, describe groups arriving by land and sea. Egyptian texts name several peoples, the Peleset, Shurdan, Shekelesh, Denyen, Cheker, and Weshwesh, among them, and portray a massive confrontation in which Egypt resisted them. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show ships, warriors, prisoners, and the violence of invasion. For generations, it was tempting to treat the Sea Peoples as the single answer, a vast coalition of barbarian invaders who swept out of nowhere and destroyed civilization. But history is usually more complicated. The Sea Peoples were likely not one unified nation with one king, one homeland, and one plan. They may have included raiders, migrants, mercenaries, displaced communities, and groups already destabilized by the same economic and environmental pressures crushing the old kingdoms. They were not necessarily the cause of the collapse. They may also have been one of its symptoms. When food becomes scarce, people move. When governments weaken, borders become porous. When trade routes fail, sailors can become raiders, soldiers can become mercenaries, and communities can search for land, safety, or plunder. In that sense, the arrivals by sea may have been less like the first crack in a wall, and more like the flood rushing through cracks that already existed. Egypt survived the crisis, but survival came at a cost. Ramesses III faced invasion during his reign. His inscriptions claim that enemies from the north had devastated lands before turning toward Egypt. He fought them in a land battle and, according to Egyptian accounts, defeated seaborne attackers in the Nile Delta. Egypt had advantages other states did not. The Nile still provided an agricultural base. Its geography gave it defensive depth. Its government, despite severe strain, remained strong enough to mobilize troops and fleets. But Egypt was not untouched. Its empire in the Levant weakened. Its resources declined. Internal problems intensified. Labor disputes, corruption, economic pressure, and political instability emerged in the decades that followed. Egypt had survived the fire, but it was no longer the same empire that had entered the crisis. Meanwhile, the map of the eastern Mediterranean was being erased. Hattusa was gone. Ugarit was gone. Mycenaean palace culture was shattered. Major cities in Anatolia, the Levant, and Greece suffered destruction, abandonment, or sharp decline. International diplomacy collapsed because there were fewer kings left to send letters. Trade diminished because ports, routes, and markets no longer worked as before. The old order depended on coordination. Coordination depended on stability, and stability had vanished. This is why the Bronze Age collapse is best understood not as one dramatic event, but as a cascade. Drought may have reduced food production. Food shortages may have driven migration and unrest. Migration and unrest may have fueled raids and warfare. Warfare damaged cities and trade. Damaged trade made it harder to obtain bronze, grain, and other essentials. Weak governments lost legitimacy. Rebellion became more likely. Defenses failed. More cities burned. Each disaster amplified the next. A palace could survive one bad harvest. It could survive one defeated army. It could survive one interrupted trade route. But could it survive drought, famine, conflict, migration, disrupted trade, internal revolt, and the loss of allied support at the same time? Many could not. The great irony is that the Bronze Age world may have collapsed partly because it was so advanced. Its empires were interconnected. Their elites depended on trade, bureaucracy, and specialized labor. Their military systems relied on costly chariots, trained crews, horses, metal, and supply networks. Their cities depended on agricultural surpluses arriving from the countryside. This made them powerful in normal times. It made them brittle in extraordinary ones. A simpler community could adapt by changing crops, moving settlements, or relying on local networks. A palace state had more people to feed, more obligations to meet, more distant resources to protect, and more prestige to lose. The larger the system became, the harder it was to repair when several failures arrived together. Yet the Bronze Age collapse was not the end of humanity, nor even the end of civilization in the region. People survived, farmers continued farming, craftspeople continued making things, villages endured, new communities formed, trade eventually returned in different forms. Iron became increasingly important, not because it instantly replaced bronze everywhere, but because the old bronze-based international economy had been broken apart. From the ruins came new societies. In the Levant, the Phoenician city-states would later become major maritime traders. In the highlands of Canaan, new communities took root. In Anatolia and Syria, smaller states emerged from the shadow of the Hittite Empire. In Greece, centuries later, writing returned in a new alphabetic form. City-states rose, and the world that produced Homer, Athens, Sparta, and classical Greece began to take shape. The collapse was an ending, but it was also a transformation. Still, it is worth sitting with the silence that came before the rebuilding. A palace burns. A scribe's final tablet hardens in the heat. A king sends a message asking for ships that will not come. A merchant waits at a port where no cargo arrives. A family leaves a city because the grain is gone. A soldier fights for a kingdom already too weak to save. They did not know they were living through the end of an age. They only knew that the world their parents had trusted was breaking apart. That is what makes the Bronze Age collapse feel so modern. Not because ancient empires were identical to the world today, but because they remind us that complexity is never the same thing as security. The systems that connect people can create wealth, knowledge, and power. But when stress reaches every part of the network at once, connection can also carry failure farther and faster than anyone expects. By around 1150 BCE, the old Bronze Age order had been shattered. Across the region, major cities had been destroyed or abandoned, diplomatic relationships had broken down, and several palace states had disappeared. The kings had fallen, the palaces were empty, the letters had stopped, and across the eastern Mediterranean, a new world began in the ashes of the old one.